Good morning. My name is Amy Locklear Hertel, and I bring you greetings from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I'm speaking to you from our School of Social Work. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina and a descendant of the Coharie Indian tribe, and I presently serve as director of the UNC American Indian Center, where our mission is to serve as a bridge between the university and tribal nations, leveraging the resources and expertise of each to meet mutually beneficial goals. Before I begin this morning, I'd like to first pay respect to the Osage Nation on whose tribal territory and homeland Washington University in St. Louis now stands. And to Dr. Molly Tovar and Dr. Michael Sheridan, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to speak at the symposium. The title of my talk today is Who Owns the Land? An Argument for Asset Ownership in Indian Country. I've been asked to talk about land and land ownership as it pertains to tribal nations, and particularly federal Indian policy. And given my research and my background in asset building with tribes, I've decided to focus for the next 15 minutes or so on the following topics: federal Indian policy and the federal trust responsibility, the utility of assets in indigenous communities, the similarities between the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, and connections that I see between asset control and tribal self-determination. I'll draw from my years of experience as a corporate attorney, as an academic, and a practitioner who has worked with tribes, particularly tribes in North Carolina, as they acquire, grow, manage, and develop assets. So when I think of federal Indian policy, I think of it in terms of asset holdings and ownership for tribes. First, prior to colonization and during the early US relations, tribes had lots of assets and they controlled those assets. They really had an abundance of assets. And during that time, they had the greatest amount of self-determination over their lives and their well-being. We moved them between the eras of removal and reservation all the way through determination, when tribes lost more than 90 million acres of land. Actually, the land was taken from tribes and given to white settlers, often without compensation. By the late 1800s, legal scholars have suggested that nearly 400 treaties were signed between the United States government and tribes. This era, this time period, established what we know today as the federal trust responsibility, which is the obligation between the federal government and tribal nations to act in good faith when dealing with tribes and their assets. Then during the 1960s, Congress terminated its trust responsibility with many tribes, which was devastating to tribal sovereignty and to the social and economic circumstances that existed at the time in Indian country. So over that 150-year time frame or so, tribes had many assets stripped away, and there were tremendous limitations placed on their ability to self-determine their futures. In the current policy era of self-determination, tribes are seeking control of assets as a means towards exercising tribal sovereignty and tribal self-determination for their citizens. So as I mentioned before, my area of study is asset building in tribal communities, and my initial research set out to explore how money was saved in the Lumbee tribal community. While my questions asked participants about saving financial resources, the participants kept referring to the range of assets that you see here. They talked extensively about living off the land, about relying on the trusted institutions within the community, and the values of reciprocity and respect, which are critical to having social capital within the tribe. They also talked about saving money as well, but most often it was talked about in the context of building or leveraging other capitals that were not primarily financial. So this aspect of my research confirmed what others had found at First Nations Development Institute, really that the term assets in tribal communities means more than financial assets alone. Instead, it's a holistic view of asset building in Indian country that takes into account, yes, the financial assets, but also the other capitals you see here. So I really believe this is an important distinction to make between mainstream society and tribal nations. In mainstream society, generally, asset building policies are designed to build individual wealth. However, in tribal communities, and based on my experience, tribal asset building policies invest in assets that are communally held by the tribe. and enjoyed by the citizens. So this prioritization of community over the individual is important in tribal communities and explains why culturally there's often a disconnect between the values of mainstream society and those of Native nations. So why then does asset ownership matter? And I'm not talking about assets that are held in trust by the federal government for tribes. I'm talking about true ownership of assets, even fee simple ownership of land. Why does that matter? Well, we know that in order to truly develop something, in order to assert control or management over a resource, in order to truly self-determine the use, the sustainability, the future, the preservation of an asset, one has to hold it and own it, right? So let's think about this on an individual level. Let's say that you rent an apartment, and as a tenant, your rental agreement most likely won't allow you to transfer the rental property to another tenant unilaterally. It also probably will not allow you to sell the property to another or to leverage it as security for the acquisition of other assets. Why? Well, it's because you don't truly own the property. You have the right to live and enjoy the property, but you don't own the property, and you can't determine what to do with that property in the future. This is similar to the difference we see between land held in trust by the federal government and land held and owned by tribes. Land held in trust for tribes affords most tribes the ability to live on the land and to enjoy the land, in some places, in ways even to take care of the land, but it does not give the tribes the full ownership or the ability to do with the land what they determine is in their own best interests. So the greater one's ownership over an asset, the more one is able to control that asset. So we know ownership offers independence. Likewise, it offers the ability to exert self-determination. So ownership truly does matter. So let's spend just a few moments here talking about the proposed pipeline paths of the Dakota Access Pipeline, and in a moment I'll address the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. The Dakota Access Pipeline stretches from North Dakota to Illinois, and it's about 1,000 miles long. You can see the map here, and while the pipeline does not actually cross a reservation, it does come within a mile or two of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. Down the way, it does stretch beneath the Missouri River, which supplies water to the Standing Rock Sioux as well as other reservations downstream. And so while the path of the pipeline does not technically cross land owned by tribes, tribal leaders have argued that it has the potential to impact their drinking water and thereby forcing those tribes along the way to disproportionately bear the burden of energy needs in the US, in North America, and globally. The disproportionate weight of that falls on these reservations. Here we see the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, and it's a 600-mile, this is a natural gas pipeline that stretches from West Virginia through Virginia and then down into North Carolina. And look at the proposed path and the connection of the tribes here in the state. Do you see any similarities between the pipeline and the tribal territories? Well, they follow along similar paths. Again, while this pipeline itself does not cross federal trust land, it does run through 4 tribal territories. The tribes are the Meherrin Nation, the Haliwa-Saponi Indian Tribe, the Coharie Indian Tribe, and the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina. And the draft environmental impact statement for this Atlantic Coast Pipeline, it was just released on December 30th, and I'll tell you, it's 2,375 pages long. It's a daunting document. And while the comment period is now open, it will soon close on April 6th. This comment period, this window, represents an opportunity for tribes along the path to assert their tribal sovereignty by having their concerns or opposition over the pipeline formally filed. It also represents the only opportunity remaining for the tribes interested in mitigating the impact of the pipeline through their tribal territories, again, to voice their opinions. Once this comment period closes, the window of opportunity to influence the path, the presence, or the impact of the pipeline closes with it as well. The table you see here measures county health rankings across 4 counties in those tribal territories, and the rankings were established by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Now, there are 100 counties in the state of North Carolina, so the higher the ranking, the lower the county actually fared in that health measure in the state. And across the majority of measures, as you see here, all 4 counties fared poorly. In fact, those rankings in yellow represent those categories where the counties scored in the 20th percentile in the state. In fact, Robinson County, home of the Lumbee tribe, ranks last in the state in terms of quality of life, health behavior, and clinical care, again, according to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And they are nearly last in the social and economic factors category as well. These are the counties and the tribal territories that will bear the burden of the pipeline in terms of property devaluation by the presence of the easements, the potential health risks associated with potential ruptures, and the impacts on the natural resources like the vast river system in the state. So land. Land is of great cultural and spiritual significance to Indian tribes, and many Indian communities continue to rely on land for food and for recreation. For the Lumbee, as well as other tribes in North Carolina, we're river people. Our identity and our culture is influenced by the land and the water. It's defined by our surroundings and natural resources. The sign you see here appears along the Lumber River in Robinson County. The sign warns of high mercury levels in the water and recommends that people should limit their consumption of the largemouth bass and the blackfish in this river to no more than 2 meals per month. In fact, women of childbearing age and children should not eat from this river until, quote unquote, further notice. Yet there are people who eat out of this river because for some of them, it's their only source of affordable freshwater fish that's available to them. This is how some people supply for themselves and supply their needs for their families. And while the river is enjoyed and respected by the tribal citizens in the community, it's not controlled by the tribe. In fact, the river itself has been polluted by many livestock and large farming operations, as well as processing plants that are situated in Robinson County. Those institutions, those businesses are also not controlled by the tribe. So as a result of industry and local government, decision-making is outside of the tribe's control, and the river is of limited utility. It's even dangerous to tribal citizens. This is similar to what we see happening with the pipelines. It's difficult for tribes to protect the health and welfare of their citizens and to determine their futures when those pipelines are just feet beyond their control, as in the case with the Dakota Access Pipeline, are literally in their territory, as in the case with the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. It's further challenging when tribes who are directly in the path of the pipelines are not consulted or engaged during the pipeline planning or responding in the response to the draft environmental impact statement. It's challenging when they're not even offered the opportunity for mitigation. And we take all this in consideration, especially when there exists, as we've covered, a federal trust responsibility and a consultation responsibility on the part of the federal government, as it's supposed to work with federally recognized tribes. But as history has demonstrated, tribes cannot rely on the federal government to always act in their best interest or to consult them in a timely and respectful and meaningful manner, all because too often the interests of the parties are at odds. So remember the prioritization of communal assets over individual wealth that I talked about at the beginning of this talk? Well, it's a real tension. And we can see that tension playing out in the case of the Dakota Access Pipeline, as well as the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. And this is why I believe that tribal asset ownership is so important. As tribal asset ownership increases, so too does tribal sovereignty and self-determination. So in closing, land ownership and control is at the very core of tribal sovereignty. And when it's threatened, when it's not protected, or when it's harmed, all of the capitals in a tribal community suffer, from the natural resources to the institutions, to the human, the cultural, and the social capital, and yes, even the political capital of the nation is challenged. And this is why, folks, the stakes are so high. For tribes, when it comes to discussions like the one you're having today, these are very important discussions. And so in closing, I would like to applaud Washington University and the Catherine and Booter Center for American Indian Studies for taking on this important topic and for hosting this symposium. I'd like to thank you for your time this morning and appreciate your attention. Here you see my contact information. You're welcome to contact me if you have any questions. And I know my colleague and friend there, Stephen Gunn, is going to be able to speak with you more in depth about the legal aspects that I skimmed over today as it pertains to environmental justice and Indigenous rights. Again, thank you and have a wonderful symposium.